When communism collapsed in Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s, it was assumed to mean the triumph of free market capitalism over all other alternatives. According to author and independent economic consultant Harry Shutt, however, it would be premature to judge the competition over. His latest book, The Decline of Capitalism, Can the Self-Regulated Profit System Survive?, takes a critical look at the global economic situation and at the response of governments to what he terms an economic crisis. 2 weeks ago, I spoke by telephone with Harry Shutt from his home in Oxford. What, in your view, is the trouble with capitalism?
Well, the trouble with capitalism is essentially in many respects the same as it's always been, which is that it suffers from a perpetual tendency towards overproduction and excess capacity. And this is an idea which many people will recognize goes back to Karl Marx, and he first noticed this 150 years ago. And of course, this is the basis of what we call the business cycle. And I dare say listeners will be familiar with that, which is the idea that you periodically get excess capacity and consequent overproduction, which leads to intensified competition and therefore a cyclical squeeze on people's incomes and a fall back in consumption until the market corrects itself and a lot of the capacity is shaken out. But of course this can lead to massive unemployment, as it has done in the past, and I would argue has done also in the present. And this causes an immense amount of economic distress.
Can we just go back to a point there you made, please? You talk about the increasing competition, squeezing people's incomes. Mm-hmm. Competition is usually portrayed as being a beneficial phenomenon that reduces prices for consumers. Are lowered incomes the flip side of that?
Well, yes, competition can be beneficial. In fact, I've written about this in one of my other books, which I won't seek to drag into the discussion, but it is obviously beneficial to us as consumers, when we see people competing to gain our custom by providing better and cheaper products. Unfortunately, it has a downside because this tends, under certain circumstances, and particularly when there's overcapacity, to lead to shakeout of competition, which may eventually also lead to monopoly, which then produces actually the opposite of competition, and that's why it's necessary, in order to make it work at all, to have very effective anti-monopoly legislation. But in general, it has this destructive element which produces, in line with the business cycle, these periodic bouts of overcapacity and high unemployment, because in order to compete with each other, I hope I've clarified the point, in order to compete with each other, people will invest in extra capacity, and then they will find that that's too much, and then you get the shakeout and the downside. And in fact, you could argue that this process is extremely wasteful, precisely because it leads to people to invest in productive capacity, which then turns out to be useless.
You've compared the situation today, the growth rates in countries across the developed and developing countries, with that of the 1950s and 1960s. What's the difference between those two periods?
Well, roughly speaking, you could say that growth rates in the last 10 to 20 years, as measured by the most authoritative institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the OECD, that have shown an average rise in the GDP of about 2 to 3% over the last 20 years, which is about half what it was in the 1960s. And in fact, it's even lower than the 1970s was considered a bad period, and it was lower than the 60s. But in fact, in the 80s and 90s, it was lower still. So I think you can see there's been or at least I think if you consult the figures, you will see, and this is not widely publicized, that there has been this long-term decline in growth rates compared with the immediate post-war period.
How have the business and financial communities responded to this situation of low growth rates?
They have, obviously in line with the traditional business cycle, they have intensified their moves to compete with each other. They have, and this has meant shakeout of labour and efforts to increase efficiency and raise competitiveness. And this of course has led on to the, or as one would say, I say of course, I mean it's in line with what you'd expect from the normal procedure of the business cycle. This intensifying competition has led to decreasing profitability, and as I say, in line with the classical experience as identified by Karl Marx, this has seen a rundown in profitability and a slowing of growth. It has also led on to what one might call, because profitability has been lower, it is, and again this is in line with past experience, it has also led to an increased amount of speculative activity, which is where instead of, because reinvesting money in the same businesses or in productive activity cannot yield the same returns as in the past, or the same returns which the markets and the shareholders demand, people have put money instead into speculation, which means instead of productive investment, it means essentially buying businesses and commodities and whatever cheap and trying to sell them dear. I'm sure people know what speculation means, but that's essentially what it is.
That would be the kind of thing that was witnessed during the .com bubble.
Absolutely, that's a classic example of it, and you now have the same thing happening in real estate markets, at least certainly in the UK and in the United States, and this is pushing housing prices to unsustainable levels. I think a lot of people would argue. It's also, you mentioned the .com bubble. That was a very good example of how we saw a quite unsustainable rise in the level of stock markets during the 80s and 90s. In fact, this is referred to in my book, but where there's a table which shows a very rapid rise in the benchmark index in the United States, which has been reflected worldwide, you could say, and where stock markets were rising even after adjusting for inflation, typically by 10% a year over the best part of 20 years. Now, against a background of growth of no more than 3% a year, anyone should be able to see that this was unsustainable. And yet, although a few journalists did point this out, it did not stop a lot of people who should have known better from continuing to say that everything was booming and would continue to boom, and that we'd all get richer and richer forever.
You're listening to Close Up on Livia 103.2FM. I'm Aidan McKeown, and I'm talking to Harry Shutt, author of The Decline of Capitalism. You say in your book, The Decline of Capitalism, that market fall from, I think it was March 2000, the technology stocks were at their peak.
Right.
That process of shaking out is only part of the way through. How much further do you think it has to go?
Well, of course, there has been since late 2002, which was about 2.5 years after the shakeout began, there has been quite a recovery in the market. But I would say that if you take it from today's levels, I would think if you say, for example, if you take the index I refer to in the book is the Standard & Poor's 500 in the States, which is standing now at about 1,200. I would think it would have to go at least 40%, maybe 50% below that level before the shakeout will be complete. But I hesitate to be very definite about that, because usually you can't, if you try and estimate what it would be worth, what would be fair value, it traditionally tends to go far lower than that. But I have to confess, I'm not very good at forecasting markets, and were that not the case, I might be making my living in a different way.
You referred to the response of some business journalists to various events. What has been, how would you view the official response of governments and of established media to the economic situation? And why do you think your prognosis is